The man known to history as Neville Chamberlain was born Arthur Neville Chamberlain on the 18th of March 1869 at his father's house of Southbourne in the district of Edgbaston in Birmingham in England. Neville's father, Joseph Chamberlain Jr., was a businessman who moved to Birmingham in 1854 at the age of 18 after joining his father and uncle in an enterprise manufacturing screws, incorporated as Nettlefold and Chamberlain. The factories in Birmingham were powering the Industrial Revolution, and by the early 1860s, Birmingham had become the fourth largest urban centre in England, with a population of almost 300,000, though it would not be granted city status until 1889. Previous generations of Chamberlains had been shoemakers and members of the liveried company of cordwainers in the City of London. During the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars at the turn of the 19th century, Neville's grandfather Joseph Chamberlain Sr. made boots for British soldiers. The family were Unitarian Christians who rejected the Trinity and believed in God as a single person, denying the divine nature of Jesus Christ. Unitarians were cut off from the mainstream of society, and until 1813, the denial of the Trinity was considered a criminal offence. As a result, the Unitarians opposed the British social and political elite and favoured social reform. In the screw-making business of Nettlefold and Chamberlain, a young Joe Chamberlain took an interest in the welfare of his workers and introduced a 9-hour day, ensuring that there would be no strikes at his factory. He would later serve as mayor of Birmingham, a Liberal Member of Parliament, and was a cabinet minister by 1880. In July 1861, Joe Chamberlain married Harriet Kenrick, who gave birth to a daughter Beatrice in 1862, before dying while giving birth to her son Austin in October 1863. The loss of his wife left Chamberlain heartbroken, and it was only in 1868 that he married Harriet's cousin and mother to Neville, Florence Kenrick. Florence was a 20-year-old teacher at the Unitarian Sunday School when she married Joe Chamberlain. Florence took care of her 2 stepchildren as her own, involved herself with local charities, and supported her husband's political career by encouraging him to stand for the town council in 1869. Between 1869 and 1873, she gave birth to 1 son, Neville, and 3 daughters, Ida, Hilda, and Ethel. On the 13th of February 1875, with her son Neville just short of his 6th birthday, she gave birth to a 5th child, but died along with her baby the following day. The loss of 2 wives from childbirth led Joe Chamberlain to lose faith in religion, but he would marry for a 3rd time in 1888. After the loss of his mother in 1875, Neville Chamberlain was brought up by his Aunt Caroline, and later his half-sister Beatrice. A year later, his father Joseph Chamberlain was elected to Parliament to represent the town of Birmingham. While retaining his seat on the Birmingham Town Council, Joe Chamberlain belonged to the radical wing of the Liberal Party and supported free education, universal male voting rights, and increased protection for trade unions. After establishing himself as the dominant force in Birmingham's local politics, in 1877 he formed the National Federation of Liberal Associations. After helping the Liberals win the 1880 general election, Chamberlain joined William Gladstone's cabinet as President of the Board of Trade. Despite his support for radical domestic policies, Joe Chamberlain was also a strong supporter of the British Empire, and when Gladstone came out in favour of granting Ireland a form of self-government known as Home Rule in March 1886, Chamberlain resigned from the cabinet, which resulted in the collapse of the government. His actions and determined opposition to Home Rule split the Liberal Party and resulted in the creation of a faction known as the Liberal Unionists. The Liberal Unionists entered an alliance with the Conservative or Tory Party, but retained a separate party identity until 1912. Chamberlain himself would not return to the cabinet until 1895, when he joined Lord Salisbury's Conservative government as Colonial Secretary. While Joseph Chamberlain climbed the political ladder in the late 1870s, young Neville and his sisters were enveloped in the political atmosphere surrounding their father. Influential Liberal politicians, Gladstone among them, frequented the Chamberlain Birmingham house. Neville was sent to preparatory school in Southport in Merseyside, before moving on to rugby school in April 1882. Neville hated life at rugby and spent much of his time alone as he developed an interest in music and literature before leaving in 1886 at the age of 17. While Joe Chamberlain had envisaged a political career for his eldest son Austin, he wanted Neville to go into business. Accordingly, while Austin read history at Trinity College, Cambridge, Neville was sent to study science and engineering at Mason College in his hometown of Birmingham. During his 2 years at Mason, Neville was uninterested in the subjects taught at the college and finished bottom of his class. As he was living at home, he was well informed about the British political scene and his father's part in it, and he followed in his father's footsteps by teaching at the Sunday school. In 1888, Joe Chamberlain married his third wife, the 24-year-old American Mary Endicott, who took over management of the household. Only 5 years younger than Mary, Neville would become close friends with his stepmother, and would remain so for the rest of their lives. In 1889, Neville was apprenticed to a firm of chartered accountants, and enjoyed the work far more than his studies at Mason. Once Neville's accountancy training was complete, Joe Chamberlain reckoned that his son was ready to take on an ambitious business venture. In 1890, while on a visit to his wife's relatives in North America, Joe Chamberlain met Sir Ambrose Shea, the Canadian governor of the Bahamas, who spoke of the potentially lucrative business of growing the sisal plant, a plant used mainly to produce hemp fiber for ropes. Having previously sold his business interests and finding it difficult to maintain his lifestyle on a politician's income, Joe Chamberlain was sufficiently interested to invest in the scheme. He believed that 21-year-old Neville was ready to take on the responsibilities of managing a business venture, and in November 1890, Neville arrived in the Bohemian capital of Nassau, along with his elder half-brother Austin, to take control of the business. Shea had promised that while the plant could not be cultivated until its 4th year, its first crop would cover all the initial capital expenditure. The two brothers believed these projections were far too optimistic, but figured that it would only take 2 years to make back the initial investment. Despite the financial risks involved, in 1891, Neville set out to establish a sisal plantation on the island of Andros, around 100 miles west from Nassau. Neville was impressed by the diversity of plant life on the island, but he had a far more challenging task than observing the flora and fauna. Establishing a profitable enterprise to replenish the family's finances was not straightforward in any shape or form. After hiring a local plantation manager, Michael Knowles, Neville and his team worked for 6 days a week in hot weather, clearing the ground and building a plantation house, which he named Mastic Point. He catered to the needs of his workers and the local community by opening a school and a savings bank. Over the course of the next 4 years, the Andros Fiber Company employed up to 800 workers, with over 6,000 acres of land planted and £13,000 invested in the plantation. When Knowles's wife died following complications from childbirth, a fate that Neville knew all too well, he insisted that his manager take an extended leave, significantly increasing his own workload. Despite Neville's hard work, the profitability of the venture came into question when he realized that the plant was not as fruitful as he had been led to expect, and the crop traded at £13 on the London market rather than £25 per tonne as originally anticipated. Although Joe Chamberlain proposed investing another £20,000 in the plantation, in March 1896, Neville informed his father that he had cut the last of the crop and saw no way of recouping the losses. When Neville sold the business, all he got was £200 in return. With the purchase of the land and the investments in the plantation, Joe Chamberlain had lost over £50,000 in the venture. Neville returned home in 1896 with the sense that he had failed his family, while his brother Austin was in the process of embarking on a distinguished political career of his own after being appointed Civil Lord of the Admiralty in 1895. After the failed Caribbean adventure, Joe Chamberlain decided that Neville's business career should continue in the more familiar territory of industrial Birmingham. Neville was appointed chairman of Elliott's Metal Company Limited, a metalworking firm that exported brass items to India. With financial assistance from his father, Neville bought Hoskins & Son, a smaller enterprise specializing in the manufacture of metal ships' berths. As in the Bahamas, Neville was a proactive manager and worked long hours meeting with potential clients and keeping close control of overheads. Like his father before him, Neville took an interest in his employees and encouraged them to join trade unions. At Hoskins, he set up a bonus scheme, paying workers up to 5% extra, and established a pension plan for employees more generous than what the state provided in the early 1910s. He inherited his father's radicalism by supporting a minimum wage, combined with workers' participation in factory governance. At home, Neville grew closer to his father and maintained a close relationship with his sisters. Together, they took frequent trips to Europe in addition to a 4-month tour of India and Burma. Neville enjoyed outdoor pursuits, including shooting and fishing, as well as cycling and taking long walks of up to 20 miles a day. Beyond his immediate family, he continued to be an introvert and was expected to remain a lifelong bachelor after a failed attempt in 1903 to court the singer Rosalind Seller, a friend of his sister Hilda. It was only in 1910 that the 40-year-old Neville Chamberlain was introduced by his half-sister Beatrice to Anne Cole, a distant connection by marriage, and the couple married on the 5th of January 1911. The newlywed couple shared an interest in music, the arts, and outdoor activities. Following their marriage, Neville and Anne moved to a house named Westbourne, next to the Botanical Gardens in Edgbaston. The couple's first child, a daughter named Dorothy, was born on Christmas Day 1911, 3 years later followed by their son, Frank, who was born in January 1914. By the time of his marriage, Neville Chamberlain was a successful businessman who was also closely involved in civic organizations, promoting healthcare and education in the city. As Neville became more involved in his community, his father also continued to play a significant role in local affairs. Joseph Chamberlain was instrumental in Mason College's transformation into the University of Birmingham, where he became the university's first chancellor in 1900. However, when the university faced a financial shortfall at the end of the decade, it was Neville who raised £250,000 to maintain the institution. He also later became a member of the University Council. Neville Chamberlain focused extensively on healthcare, and he served as a director and later governor at Birmingham General Hospital. And in 1906, he became a founding member of the United Hospitals Committee of the British Medical Association. Neville believed that workers should have access to affordable healthcare and persuaded the doctors at the hospital to treat poorer patients for half their normal fee. Chamberlain did not consider his involvement in civic activities to be political in nature, but politics in the Chamberlain family could not be avoided. After Joe Chamberlain suffered a serious stroke in 1906, Neville served as secretary of the Liberal Unionist Association and spoke on his father's behalf at Liberal Unionist meetings. Prior to the stroke, Neville's father continued to play havoc in British politics. Having split the Liberals 2 decades earlier on the issue of Home Rule, in 1903, Joe Chamberlain split the Conservatives by coming out against free trade in favour of preferential trading relationships with Britain's colonies, a system known as imperial preference, which he considered essential to keep the empire together. Free trade had enabled Britain and its navy to dominate international trade over the course of the 19th century, and the Conservative Prime Minister Arthur Balfour was not prepared to abandon it altogether. after Joe resigned from Balfour's cabinet in September 1903, Austin Chamberlain was made Chancellor of the Exchequer as part of Balfour's efforts to keep his government together. After Balfour's Conservatives were defeated in a landslide by the Liberals in the 1906 election, he was forced by the remaining Conservative members of Parliament to support imperial preference. Despite the activities of his father and brother in Westminster, Neville had no interest in entering national politics. Instead, he was more inclined to play his part in the government of his native city, and in November 1911, he was elected as a Liberal Unionist councillor for the newly created Greater Birmingham Council. Neville was immediately appointed chairman of the Town Planning and Health Committees, and over the next 2 years, he adopted the first 2 town planning schemes in the country, which would later be emulated by other cities. While in 1913, he chaired a committee to improve housing conditions for the poor, successfully building cleaner and brighter houses for workers in the suburbs. Chamberlain's housing initiatives and his efforts to improve the livelihoods of the urban poor were far more in tune with the policies of the Union-affiliated Labour Party than either the Conservatives or the Liberal Unionists. When Joseph Chamberlain died in July 1914, Neville had already become a dominant player in Birmingham politics, and in 1915 he followed in his late father's footsteps by becoming Lord Mayor of Birmingham. Neville Chamberlain served as Lord Mayor during the First World War, which had broken out in August 1914. Chamberlain set an example of the sacrifices the country was expected to make during the war by waiving half his salary as mayor. He supported the morale of Birmingham soldiers fighting at the front by sending them a tin containing Christmas pudding and biscuits each Christmas, while he and Annie personally signed cards addressed to the family of soldiers who died at war. The outbreak of war also affected Chamberlain's business interests, and Hoskins was asked by the government to build a steel mill to support the manufacture of armaments. While other businesses in Birmingham suffered from wartime strikes, Chamberlain's factories were largely spared. Since joining the council, Chamberlain had hoped to establish a local bank for the city, and when Birmingham and other urban centres were asked to set up savings committees to help finance wartime expenditures, he took the opportunity to lobby the government for the creation of a city bank controlled by the local government. Austin Chamberlain had joined Herbert Asquith's wartime coalition government as Secretary of State for India, but informed his brother that the government was uninterested in such a proposition. Undeterred, Neville decided to lobby the government himself, and was soon granted his wish with the creation of the Birmingham Corporation Savings Bank in 1916, which was reorganized as the Birmingham Municipal Bank in 1919 after the end of the war. The bank paid a high rate of interest to workers who deposited their salaries in it, and it would later become the country's second largest local savings bank. During the war, Chamberlain also worked with the national government to establish an air raid warning system for the Midlands. Although most of his work as Lord Mayor was naturally focused on the war effort, Chamberlain did not neglect his beloved arts, and in 1916 he began a campaign to establish an orchestra in the city by organising a series of concerts conducted by Sir Thomas Beecham, laying the foundations for the official creation of the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra in 1919. Chamberlain's work as Lord Mayor of Birmingham and the negotiations he led on the city's behalf with the national government in Westminster brought him to the attention of the Asquith government. In 1915, Chancellor David Lloyd George asked him to be a member of the Liquor Control Board, established to reduce wartime consumption of alcohol. But after a short tenure, Chamberlain left the board and chose to focus on his duties as Lord Mayor. When the dynamic and forceful Lloyd George succeeded Asquith as Prime Minister in December 1916, he offered Chamberlain the post of Director General of National Service, following a recommendation from Austin. Conscription into the army had been introduced in January 1916, but within a couple of weeks of becoming Prime Minister, Lloyd George created the Department of National Service with the broader task of balancing the demands for manpower from various sources, including the military, industry and the merchant navy, in order to more effectively wage total war against the Central Powers. Asked to make a decision immediately, Chamberlain accepted the post and resigned as Lord Mayor of Birmingham. In an announcement to Parliament on the afternoon of the 19th of December, Lloyd George set unrealistic expectations that within a matter of weeks, Chamberlain would be able to recruit an industrial army of volunteers to mobilize the whole of the labor strength of this country for war purposes. By the beginning of January 1917, Lloyd George was already frustrated that Chamberlain had not presented a plan of action. Chamberlain ultimately came up with a plan to suspend existing exemptions from military service and direct recruits into the war economy, while volunteers would be assigned to roles they were best qualified for, with the assistance of employment exchanges. Within several months, 350,000 men had volunteered for civilian wartime service under Chamberlain's department, but an inadequate staff and lack of coordination with other relevant government departments made Chamberlain's job impossible. Relations with Lloyd George failed to improve, and Chamberlain was outraged when the Prime Minister imposed parliamentary secretaries upon his department without consultation. Frustrated with his lack of control and believing that it was impossible to run a government department without his own parliamentary seat, he resigned on the 8th of August 1917, closing a chapter of his life that proved as disappointing as the failure of the Andros venture decades earlier. In the aftermath of his resignation, Chamberlain rued the fact that had he not accepted the ill-fated appointment, he could still have been Lord Mayor of Birmingham. He remained a member of the council and returned to work at Hoskins and Elliott's, as well as the Birmingham Small Arms Company, where he had been a director. Rather than focusing on his business interests, he decided that he would continue to dedicate his life to public service after reflecting on the fact that two of his cousins, Johnny and Norman, had been killed in action during the war. Although he had earlier rejected several approaches to stand for Parliament, the 49-year-old Neville Chamberlain now decided that it was time to do so. The Representation of the People Act of February 1918 gave the vote to all men over 21 and women over 30, in recognition of the contribution of women and working-class men to the national war effort. Accordingly, Birmingham's electorate more than quadrupled from just under 100,000 to over 400,000, and the city's 7 parliamentary constituencies increased to 12. After presiding over the formal amalgamation of the Birmingham Conservatives and the Liberal Unionists as the Birmingham Unionist Party in the summer of 1918, Chamberlain decided to stand for the newly created working-class constituency of Birmingham Ladywood. Immediately after the end of the First World War in November 1918, Lloyd George called a general election for the 14th of December. Despite his conservative affiliation, Chamberlain stood on a platform of workers' rights and social welfare and won election to Parliament by a majority of over 7,000 votes. Lloyd George and Conservative Party leader Andrew Bonar Law had gone into the election intending to continue their wartime political alliance, and the governing coalition won 511 seats at the election. Most of these were Conservatives, who won 374 seats, while Lloyd George's Liberals returned 137 MPs to Westminster. The opposition consisted of the Labour Party, with 60 seats, while Asquith's Independent Liberals, who had refused to go into coalition with the Conservatives during the war, were reduced to 34 MPs. The extent to which the lower classes increased their political and economic influence during the war threatened the Conservatives who dominated Parliament. The great empires of Germany and Austria-Hungary had collapsed following the war, while in Russia, Vladimir Lenin's communist Bolsheviks had seized power in November 1917 and executed Tsar Nicholas II and his family the following July. The late Tsar's cousin, King George V, feared for the security of his own throne, and the Conservative Party was equally keen to prevent the political establishment from being overthrown in a socialist revolution. While Austin Chamberlain returned to the cabinet as Chancellor, Bonar Law asked Neville to join the government as a junior minister. Having fallen out with Lloyd George during the National Service debacle, the younger Chamberlain informed the Tory leader that he would not serve under Lloyd George. Austin's loyalty towards the Prime Minister and Neville's hostility towards him increased the distance between the two brothers, as did Neville's belief that Austin had moved away from their father's radicalism in favour of traditional reactionary conservatism. In the spring of 1921, Bonar Law stepped down from the leadership of the Conservative Party due to ill health, and Austin succeeded him as party leader and Lloyd George's deputy prime minister. Despite his popularity as the prime minister who won the war, Lloyd George came under increasing pressure from his Conservative coalition partners, especially over his decision to enter peace negotiations to end the Anglo-Irish War of 1918-21, resulting in the creation of the Irish Free State and leaving only 6 northern counties in Ulster within the United Kingdom. In October 1922, while Neville and Annie were away visiting his stepmother's relatives, Conservative MPs met at the Carlton Club to discuss whether to break from Lloyd George and stand in the next election as an independent party. While Austin decided to remain loyal to Lloyd George, Bonar Law, who believed he had recovered from throat cancer, backed the rebels and soon became Prime Minister after leading the Conservatives to victory in the November election. When Bonar Law offered Neville the office of Postmaster General, he accepted despite the impact it would have on his relationship with his brother, who had continued to refuse Bonar Law's offers to bring him into the cabinet. As Postmaster General, Neville had responsibility for the Empire's wireless or radio communications network, and believed that the system should be run by the government rather than by private firms. In March 1923, Chamberlain was appointed Minister of Health, a position he was readily suited to given his interests in social welfare and his previous involvement with the Birmingham General Hospital. 2 months later, Bonar Law fell ill again and was diagnosed with terminal throat cancer, prompting his immediate resignation from office. The new Prime Minister was Stanley Baldwin, another successful Midlands businessman before being elected to Parliament in 1908. Baldwin and Chamberlain embarked on a close political partnership for the next decade and a half, and by August 1923, Chamberlain had been promoted to Chancellor of the Exchequer, the second most important ministerial office in the government, with responsibility for the nation's finances. Although Britain had emerged victorious in the First World War, the war had been costly, and the government had borrowed heavily from the United States. The economic orthodoxy of the time dictated that the government could not continue to spend beyond its means and had to cut back on expenditures, resulting in a sluggish post-war economic recovery. Baldwin and Chamberlain believed that the way to restore the economy was with tariff reform, ending free trade and adopting imperial preference to protect the economic interests of Britain and the wider empire. When Baldwin called an election for December 1923, seeking a mandate for tariff reform, Chamberlain believed it was too soon to go to the country, and though the Conservatives remained the largest party, Labour and the Liberals combined to topple Baldwin. In January 1924, the Labour Party entered the government for the first time, with its leader Ramsay MacDonald leading a minority administration with support from Asquith's Liberals. With the Conservatives in opposition, Neville helped to broker a reconciliation between Baldwin and the Tories who had remained loyal to Lloyd George. When MacDonald called an election in October 1924, a united Conservative Party returned to government by winning 413 seats in the House of Commons. Though the Tories had won a convincing victory, Chamberlain himself retained his Ladywood seat by a narrow margin of 77 votes. His Labour opponent was the charismatic populist Oswald Mosley, a former Conservative who would later become the leader of the British Union of Fascists. After his close run in 1924, Chamberlain decided to stand for the safe seat of Birmingham Edgbaston at the next election in 1929. With the Lloyd Georgists back in the party, Baldwin returned to the Prime Minister's office at No. 10 Downing Street, at the head of a cabinet of political heavyweights. Although Neville Chamberlain could have continued in the more prestigious chancellorship, he chose to return to the Ministry of Health, where he had unfinished business after his brief first stint in the job. The Exchequer went instead to Winston Churchill, who had returned to the Conservatives after 2 decades as a Liberal, while Austin Chamberlain was appointed Foreign Secretary. As Minister of Health, Neville Chamberlain was responsible for local government and housing, giving him the opportunity to pursue the social reforms he had already introduced in Birmingham. Building on his previous experience in the ministry, Chamberlain developed a reform programme made up of 25 bills, which he hoped to enact over the next 4 years. By 1929, 21 bills were passed, and the rest would be adopted in later years. In March 1925, the House passed the Housing Act, which renewed housing subsidies and stimulated the construction of 1 million homes over the next 4 years. At the same time, the Rent Restriction Act restricted the power of landlords and prevented them from charging tenants unfair rents for poor quality housing. The combined effect of these 2 pieces of legislation was to move people away from slums into higher quality housing. Working alongside Churchill, Chamberlain introduced a bill to provide pensions to widows and orphans and reduced the pension age from 70 to 65. The Local Government Act of 1929 effectively abolished the Poor Law, which had kept recipients of state relief in harsh workhouses and transferred responsibility for payments to local councils. Despite his radical welfare reform policies, many of which were supported by Labour MPs, Chamberlain became increasingly hostile towards the Labour Party in the House of Commons. In the general election of 1929, the Conservatives lost power and the Labour Party won 288 seats to become the largest party in the House of Commons, enabling MacDonald to return to number 10 in a stronger position than his previous occupation of the prime ministerial office. While in opposition, Chamberlain became chairman of the party in June 1930 and introduced reforms to modernise the party organisation. Although he had established himself as Baldwin's most likely successor, he refused to support calls from among disaffected party members to discard Baldwin after the election defeat. By the beginning of March 1931, almost every member of Baldwin's shadow cabinet believed that he should step aside. But a convincing Conservative by-election victory later that month allowed Baldwin to reassert his authority. In the meantime, MacDonald's minority Labour administration struggled to deal with the global economic depression that followed the Wall Street crash of November 1929. By the end of 1930, unemployment had increased to 2.5 million, and MacDonald struggled to reconcile the objectives of supporting the unemployed while balancing the budget. In the summer of 1931, MacDonald accepted the recommendations from a committee chaired by the financier Sir George May to make large cuts in public spending. The painful spending cuts were opposed by 8 of his ministers, and on the 24th of August, MacDonald submitted his resignation to King George V. The king insisted that MacDonald remain Prime Minister at the head of a national government with the Conservatives and Liberals to steer the country through the crisis. Baldwin had hoped to lead a Conservative minority government instead, but Chamberlain persuaded MacDonald to stay on and do his duty to king and country. A smaller cabinet of 10 members was created, including 4 Labour ministers, 4 Conservatives and 2 Liberals. Chamberlain was among the 4 Tories and returned to government for a 3rd stint as Minister of Health. In October, MacDonald called a general election to seek a mandate for his national government and returned 518 MPs, including 470 Conservatives, 35 National Liberals and a mere 13 National Labour MPs. The dominant position of the Conservatives in the government meant that the ageing MacDonald acted increasingly as a figurehead, while Baldwin set the government's agenda as MacDonald's deputy as Lord President of the Council. Chamberlain would have preferred to remain at the Ministry of Health, but National Labour Chancellor Philip Snowden's decision not to stand at the 1931 election prompted Chamberlain's return to the Exchequer. Although Baldwin continued to be the nominal chief, Chamberlain had considerable power and influence over domestic policy as Chancellor. The global depression gave Chamberlain the opportunity to achieve his father's dream of tariff reform. In late 1931, he chaired a cabinet committee investigating ways to improve the balance of trade, which recommended a general tariff of 10%, alongside preferential trade with Britain's overseas dominions and colonies. These proposals were introduced in the Import Duties Bill, which was easily passed by the Commons on the 4th of February 1932, with 454 in favour and 78 against. With his sister Hilda and stepmother Mary watching the proceedings from the public gallery, Austin Chamberlain made his way down from the backbenches to shake his brother's hand. However, a system of imperial preference could not be established unilaterally, and Chamberlain was disappointed when a conference in Ottawa in July concluded with no substantive agreements to reduce trade barriers with Canada. In his management of the public finances, Chamberlain continued the cuts to public expenditures introduced by Snowden. Interest on the war debt remained a significant burden, but in 1932, Chamberlain lowered the Bank of England's base interest rate to 2% and converted £2 billion worth of war debt from an interest rate of 5% a year to 3.5%. In June, Chamberlain and MacDonald travelled to Switzerland to attend the Lausanne Reparations Conference. The purpose of the conference was to determine the fate of the substantial reparations imposed on Germany following the end of the First World War at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which had already been suspended in 1931. By the end of the conference, Britain and France signalled that they were prepared to end Germany's reparations if their war debts to the United States were written off. Rather unsurprisingly, in December 1932, the US Congress refused to sanction the proposal. A further attempt to lobby the United States for the cancellation of war debts at the World Monetary and Economic Conference in London in June 1933 was similarly rejected by the new US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the 1933 budget, Chamberlain continued his policy of fiscal austerity, rejecting the ideas of economist John Maynard Keynes to increase government spending during an economic crisis to stimulate the economy and offset the contraction of private sector investment, which were then being implemented by President Roosevelt in his New Deal program. By 1934, the public finances were stable enough for Chamberlain to cut income tax and increase unemployment benefit, and in 1935 he announced that the economy had recovered 80% of its fall during the Depression. Chamberlain continued his interventionist approach from the Ministry of Health by establishing an unemployment assistance board and directing government spending towards house building. As he delivered his budget to the Commons in 1936, Chamberlain proudly announced that the balance of trade had increased from a deficit of £104 million to a £34 million surplus due to tariff reform. The reduction in interest rates stimulated the building of 1.25 million homes, while unemployment had fallen from 22% to 14%. In June 1935, after suffering from years of ill health, Ramsay MacDonald resigned from the premiership in favour of Stanley Baldwin. Baldwin's third term as Prime Minister was dominated by the abdication crisis following the death of George V in January 1936. As well as increasing tensions in Anglo-German relations. This gave Chamberlain greater influence over other areas of domestic policy, such as by introducing an education bill to raise the school leaving age to 15 by 1939. Although Chamberlain had cut defence spending in his early budgets, the deteriorating political situation in Europe strengthened calls for increased defence spending. The most prominent champion of rearmament was Winston Churchill, who had been absent from the Conservative front bench since 1931 after falling out with Baldwin over India policy. By 1936, a civil war had broken out in Spain between General Franco's nationalists and the left-wing Republican government, while Benito Mussolini of Italy launched an invasion of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. However, the greatest threat came from Germany, which had been led by the fascist dictator Adolf Hitler since 1933. After coming to power, Hitler violated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles by building up Germany's military capacity and occupying the demilitarized Rhineland. These developments convinced Chamberlain to increase defence spending, and in February 1937 he announced plans to spend £1.5 billion over the next 5 years. To finance the increased spending, he introduced a national defence contribution levied on businesses. Baldwin had contemplated retirement for a long time, and he decided that he would step down from the premiership in May 1937, after the coronation of King George VI. Chamberlain had been the presumed successor to Baldwin as party leader and prime minister for almost a decade, but at the age of 68 he was now expected to be a stopgap for a younger successor, most likely the 40-year-old Anthony Eden. After becoming Prime Minister on the 28th of May 1937, Chamberlain relished the opportunity to get things done. He had inherited Baldwin's cabinet, whose heavyweights included Lord Halifax as leader of the House of Lords and Lord President of the Council, the National Liberal Sir John Simon as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Samuel Hoare as Home Secretary, and Anthony Eden as Foreign Secretary. While the laid-back Baldwin had given his cabinet ministers considerable autonomy, the details-oriented Chamberlain kept a close eye on his ministers and required them to present departmental plans for the next 2 years, an approach which did not endear him to his cabinet colleagues. Chamberlain hoped to build on his accomplishments as a domestic reformer, as Chancellor and Minister of Health. But while he introduced legislation improving working conditions in factories and providing holiday pay for workers, his premiership and his legacy would be judged by his foreign policy decisions. Most of the foreign policy issues in the 1930s stemmed from the peace treaties signed after the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Under French influence, the Treaty of Versailles imposed punitive terms on Germany by taking away the provinces of East Prussia and Posen to form part of a restored Polish state. Germany was prevented from having an air force, and its army was limited to 100,000 men. President Wilson of the United States led the creation of a League of Nations to preserve global peace, but his failure to persuade the US Senate to ratify the treaty meant that the United States remained outside the organization, leaving Britain and France as the leading powers. By the mid-1920s, when it became clear that the German economy was in no position to pay its hefty reparations bill, there was a growing consensus among political elites that the Versailles settlement had been too harsh on Germany, while the threat of Russian communism supported the case for a stronger German buffer. These considerations led Austin Chamberlain and his French and German counterparts, Aristide Briand and Gustav Stresemann, to negotiate the Locarno Pact of 1925, which allowed Germany to join the League of Nations. Though Stresemann had managed to stabilize the German economy by 1929 with loans from the United States, the withdrawal of American credit after the Wall Street crash heightened the economic depression in Germany and created the conditions for Hitler's Nazi Party to come to power in the early 1930s, promising to reverse the humiliations of the Treaty of Versailles. A disaster appeared to be brewing as Hitler rapidly rebuilt the German military machine, which served to stimulate the German economy, while the British and French governments were cutting spending and sought to avoid fighting another costly war. The MacDonald and Baldwin governments believed that Germany had legitimate grievances against the Versailles settlement and adopted a policy of appeasement, seeking to preserve the peace in Europe on the belief that Hitler was merely aiming to redress the harsher peace terms. While Chamberlain was not directly involved in foreign affairs as Chancellor, he wholeheartedly supported appeasement. The brutal methods Hitler used to consolidate his domestic power in the Night of the Long Knives in 1934 prompted Chamberlain to take a more critical view of Nazism, while Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia in October 1935 represented a naked act of aggression which had nothing to do with the post-war peace settlement. Chamberlain believed the League of Nations should take action and impose economic sanctions on Italy. But in December, Foreign Secretary Samuel Hoare and his French counterpart Pierre Laval came to a secret agreement to give 2/3 of Abyssinia to Italy and allow the remaining third to retain its independence. The arrangements soon leaked to the press, and Hoare and Laval were both dismissed from office. But the episode indicated that Britain and France had lost faith in the League of Nations. Chamberlain thus reversed his position on sanctions and sought to improve relations with Mussolini, who he considered a lesser threat than Hitler. While Britain and France were distracted by Mussolini, Hitler ordered his men to march into the Rhineland on the border with France in March 1936, with instructions to withdraw if they faced any resistance. Hitler's gamble paid off, for though the French government protested, it refused to take military action without British support. Chamberlain was not involved in the decision-making process. In its aftermath, he supported the government's position that Hitler had legitimate complaints about the Versailles Treaty, and prevailed upon the cabinet to agree to restore Germany's overseas colonies as part of a general European settlement. Chamberlain had tended to defer to Austin's expertise on foreign policy, but Austin's death in March 1937, a couple of months before Neville became Prime Minister, removed this restraint. In the mid-1930s, British public opinion continued to favour armament reductions in order to maintain the peace. But by 1935, Chamberlain had already recognised the need to prepare for potential hostilities with Germany, and authorised a significant increase in defence spending. As Prime Minister, Chamberlain continued his policy of seeking to preserve peace while preparing for war. His position was challenged by Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, who believed that the Prime Minister was being too friendly with Mussolini. As a result of these tensions, Eden resigned from the Foreign Office in February 1938 and was replaced by Lord Halifax. Halifax had been serving as Eden's deputy in the Foreign Office and had fewer reservations about negotiating with Hitler and Mussolini. With Eden's departure, Chamberlain sought to take greater personal control of foreign policy and was prepared to lead direct negotiations with the leaders of Germany and Italy. The calls for Britain to rearm, which began in the early 1930s, were initially in response to the threat from Japan rather than Germany. Like the Italians, the Japanese had been on the winning side in the First World War, but believed that they had achieved less from the Paris peace settlement than they deserved. In 1931, Japan invaded the province of Manchuria in northeast China, and the League of Nations was powerless to respond. Britain feared for the security of its imperial possessions in Asia, which included Hong Kong and Singapore. Chamberlain believed that Britain had to prioritise its own defence rather than that of the colonies. But in the early 1930s, Britain was not prepared for either. In the immediate aftermath of the First World War, the government spent over £700 million a year on defence. But when Chamberlain delivered his first budget in 1932, it had fallen to £100 million, and the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force were especially neglected. From 1933 onwards, Chamberlain began to agree to increases in defence expenditures, though not to the extent recommended by the Defence Requirement Committee. By 1935, it became clear that Germany, rather than Japan, was the major threat, and Chamberlain decided to prioritise investment in the Air Force, against the advice of defence experts. While Baldwin was reluctant to pursue rearmament as it continued to be unpopular throughout the country, Chamberlain was determined to press ahead, and the spending plans for 1936 and 1937 included investment in 5 new battleships, 20 cruisers, 4 aircraft carriers, 4 new infantry battalions, and strengthening the Royal Air Force to 1,750 aircraft. In his final budget in April 1937, Chamberlain decided that military preparations were more important than fiscal prudence, and defence spending accounted for 4% of GDP. After becoming Prime Minister, Chamberlain continued to focus on building air capacity, though in December 1937, Thomas Inskip, Minister for the Coordination of Defence, decided that focus should switch to fighter production to defend the country's shores from enemy raids, rather than to continue a bomber fleet. Chamberlain's emphasis on the Navy and the Air Force reflected Britain's traditional preference to defend the island from invasion by sea while relying on continental allies for manpower on land. By 1938, however, Chamberlain accepted Secretary of War Leslie Hoare Belish's advice that the army would also need to be strengthened considerably. Although Britain was rearming rapidly, the rearmament program would not be complete until 1941, and in the meantime, Chamberlain continued in his efforts to preserve peace through diplomacy. In November 1937, Lord Halifax went to Germany on a hunting trip, during which he met Hitler at his mountaintop retreat at Berchtesgaden in Bavaria. Halifax informed Chamberlain that Hitler was interested in a general peace settlement and would be satisfied with the return of German colonies in East Africa. When Halifax's scheme was presented officially to Hitler in early March 1938, the German leader rejected the proposals. Hitler's priorities lay in Europe, and on the 12th of March, the German army annexed Austria, another act that violated the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Neither Britain or France did anything to stop the annexation, and the best Chamberlain could do was to condemn the annexation in the House of Commons. As soon as Hitler annexed Austria, he turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, in particular the Sudetenland, a strip of territory on the northern, western and southern frontiers of Czechoslovakia, dominated by German-speaking people. While he opposed forcible annexation, Chamberlain believed that Hitler was justified in wanting to incorporate the Sudeten Germans into Germany, and reflected public opinion in his unwillingness to go to war over Czechoslovakia. In May 1938, 2 Sudeten German farmers were shot by Czech border guards, leading to pro-German demonstrations in the Sudetenland organized by the Nazis and the mobilization of troops on both sides of the border. Halifax promptly warned Germany that Britain might intervene if France were to do so, and the Germans promptly withdrew, although it later emerged that the German army was not yet prepared to launch an invasion of the Sudetenland. Chamberlain and Halifax were praised for their swift reaction to the crisis. While Czechoslovak President Edvard Beneš and Sudeten Nazi leader Konrad Henlein were negotiating over the fate of the Sudetenland, in August 1938, Chamberlain sent his former cabinet colleague, Lord Runciman, to Prague to mediate. The negotiations went nowhere, as Hitler had given Henlein secret instructions not to make any agreement. By the beginning of September, Chamberlain believed that a German invasion of the Sudetenland was imminent, and decided that he should meet Hitler for direct negotiations. On the 15th of September, he boarded an aircraft for the first time in his life, and flew to meet Hitler at Berchtesgaden. After a frosty start to the negotiations, Hitler accepted Chamberlain's suggestion for the Sudetenland to be separated from the rest of Czechoslovakia, pending an agreement from France and the Czechs. Chamberlain observed after the meeting, "I got the impression that he was a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word." After his return to England, both the British cabinet and the French government agreed to the separation of the Sudetenland, and President Beneš reluctantly agreed after being informed that France would not help him. A week later, Chamberlain flew to Bad Godesberg to inform Hitler of the discussions with the French and the Czechs. He was surprised when Hitler demanded even further concessions from Czechoslovakia, including the cession of lands claimed by Poland and Hungary, and the immediate annexation of the Sudetenland. Chamberlain broke off negotiations, but the following day the two men agreed that Hitler would set out his demands in a memorandum, which Chamberlain would forward to his allies. Hitler once again raised the prospect of a general European peace settlement, but Chamberlain's optimism diminished after receiving Hitler's memorandum demanding the occupation of the Sudetenland on the 26th of September. Hitler's change of tone at Godesberg caused Halifax to turn against appeasement and advised the Prime Minister to reject the demands. On the 26th, the Foreign Office announced that in the event of an attack on Czechoslovakia, France, Great Britain and Soviet Russia would go to war. Chamberlain continued to believe that Hitler could be persuaded to return to the initial agreement at Berchtesgaden. and made arrangements for another meeting with Hitler. On the 28th of September, Chamberlain received word that Hitler had invited him to an international conference in Munich on the following day, alongside Italy's Mussolini and France's Édouard Daladier. On the 29th of September, the four leaders agreed that the Czechs would have 10 days to withdraw from the Sudetenland, and the border disputes with Poland and Hungary would be dealt with by an international commission. The four powers agreed to guarantee the integrity of what remained of Czechoslovakia after that. In his desire to make a grand gesture to announce the successful negotiations back in England, the following morning, Chamberlain asked Hitler to sign a piece of paper acknowledging the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again, which the German Führer was happy to do. Later that day, he landed at Heston Aerodrome, proudly waving the piece of paper in front of a jubilant crowd. After making his triumphant progress to Downing Street, he announced exultantly from the first-floor window that he had secured peace for our time. Chamberlain almost immediately regretted making the remark, but for the time being his appeasement policy appeared to be vindicated, while the anti-appeasers in the Conservative Party were isolated. Ever since becoming Prime Minister, Chamberlain defended his appeasement policy and silenced criticism through his control of the press. His press secretary, George Seward, helped Chamberlain control the narrative by co-opting journalists from the leading Conservative newspapers, the Daily Mail, Daily Express, Daily Telegraph, and the Times, though the pro-Eden Telegraph was left out of the fold after Eden's resignation as Foreign Secretary. Chamberlain dismissively treated any dissent as the work of Jewish or communist propaganda, sought to ensure that Hitler and Mussolini were referred to as Herr Hitler and Signor Mussolini respectively, and suppressed broadcasts which attacked Germany or Italy. In March 1939, less than 6 months after the Munich Agreement, German troops invaded Czechoslovakia and established a German protectorate, thoroughly discrediting Chamberlain's appeasement policy. On the 18th of March, the Prime Minister admitted to his cabinet that it was impossible now to negotiate as before with the Nazi regime. Although it was too late to do anything about Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain agreed to provide Anglo-French guarantees to Poland and Romania, which were seen as Hitler's next targets. When Italy invaded Albania in April, Chamberlain came to accept that Mussolini was not to be trusted either, and provided a guarantee to Greece. The failure of appeasement weakened Chamberlain's position in the Conservative Party and led to a nationwide campaign for Churchill to be given a cabinet post. As Hitler turned his attention towards Poland, Halifax persuaded Chamberlain to open negotiations for an alliance with the Soviet Union, but it was impossible to overcome Polish-Soviet mutual suspicions, while many in Britain and France continued to believe that the Soviets were the greater threat. The breakdown of Anglo-French negotiations with the Soviets created the conditions for the Nazi-Soviet Pact, signed on the 23rd of August. Fascist Germany and Communist Russia agreed publicly not to go to war with each other, and privately to divide Poland between themselves. On the 1st of September 1939, the Second World War began, following the German invasion of Poland. Despite an Anglo-French guarantee in March, Chamberlain did not go to war immediately, and on the 2nd of September he merely told the Commons that Britain and France were discussing a joint response. When Labour's deputy leader Arthur Greenwood stood to speak, the Conservative MP Leo Amery shouted, "Speak for England, Arthur." Greenwood rose to the occasion in a way that Chamberlain had not, and as the minutes ticked by, the Prime Minister continued to wait for word from France. It was only late at night that Chamberlain's cabinet forced him to issue an ultimatum for Germany to withdraw its troops by 11 a.m. on the 3rd of September. Germany refused to cooperate. Therefore, as the deadline came and passed, a morose Chamberlain addressed the nation with one of the most famous and ominous speeches in British history.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Once war was declared, Churchill joined Chamberlain's cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty. Although Britain and France were now at war with Germany, there was little either could do to defend Poland. And in mid-September, Soviet armies invaded Poland from the east to take their share. Nevertheless, as far as Chamberlain was concerned, Hitler had shown that he could not be trusted to keep his word. And when Hitler proposed a peace conference on the 6th of October after the conquest of Poland was complete, the British Prime Minister adamantly refused. Chamberlain was happy to sit tight and focus on British military production, anticipating that the German economy would be unable to cope with a long war. After appointing him to the Admiralty, Chamberlain gave Churchill considerable authority over the war effort. In early 1940, Churchill proposed an invasion of Norway to seize the port of Narvik, which supplied a large quantity of Scandinavian iron ore for the German war machine. By the time the operation was launched in April, the Germans launched their own invasion of Denmark and Norway in force, and the much smaller Allied force was forced to evacuate Narvik on the 2nd of May. On the 7th of May, the House of Commons opened its debate on the failure of the Norway campaign, during which Leo Amery quoted Oliver Cromwell and told the Prime Minister, "You have sat here too long for any good you are doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go." After Churchill closed the debate defending the government's conduct while acknowledging his own responsibility, Chamberlain's majority was reduced from over 200 to just 81. Chamberlain prepared to resign, and on the 9th of May he met with his two potential successors, Halifax and Churchill. Chamberlain favoured Halifax and asked Churchill whether he had any objection to the member of the House of Lords becoming Prime Minister. While Churchill said very little, Halifax broke the silence by arguing that Churchill would be the more effective war leader, and Chamberlain reluctantly agreed. When Germany invaded France on the 10th of May, Chamberlain changed his mind and decided to stay on as head of a national government. But when Labour leader Clement Attlee indicated that he was not willing to serve under Chamberlain, the Prime Minister stepped aside in favour of Churchill. When Churchill reduced the membership of the War Cabinet to 5, Chamberlain received the number 2 post of Lord President of the Council and retained the leadership and control of the Conservative Party. The remaining members of the War Cabinet were Halifax as Foreign Secretary, Attlee as Lord Privy Seal, and Arthur Greenwood as Minister without Portfolio. Chamberlain retained considerable responsibilities in domestic policy and chaired the War Cabinet during Churchill's frequent absences. Although the British Expeditionary Force had been sent across the English Channel to assist France, by the end of May it became clear that France was about to collapse, and it was not certain that Britain could continue the fight alone. During tense discussions in the War Cabinet at the end of May, Halifax urged immediate peace talks, mediated by Italy, which Churchill regarded as capitulation. By the 28th of May, Churchill was losing the argument in the War Cabinet, but in the evening he made an emotional appeal to the wider cabinet and received an enthusiastic response. When he returned to the War Cabinet, Churchill carried the day with Chamberlain's support, leaving Halifax isolated. Churchill hoped to strengthen his War Cabinet by bringing in Lloyd George, but deferred to Chamberlain when Neville refused to serve with him. In July 1940, following the publication of the book Guilty Men, which attacked Chamberlain and others for failing to prepare adequately for the war, Labour and Liberal MPs demanded Chamberlain's dismissal from government, but Churchill defended his predecessor and kept him in the War Cabinet. By this stage, Chamberlain was suffering from poor health, and in July 1940 his doctors diagnosed him with terminal bowel cancer. Despite the pain, Neville returned to London on the 9th of September and continued to attend the War Cabinet. but with the bombing of the capital during the Blitz, on the 19th he decided to leave for his aunt's house in Hampshire, never to return. He offered Churchill his resignation on the 22nd of September, which was only accepted on the 3rd of October, when it was clear that Chamberlain would not recover. On the 9th of November 1940, Neville Chamberlain died at the age of 71. On the 14th of November 1940, Churchill and members of his cabinet served as pallbearers for Chamberlain's casket at his funeral in Westminster Abbey. In a speech to the House of Commons a couple of days later, Churchill paid tribute to his predecessor's desire for peace and his determination to save the world from the awful, devastating struggle in which we are now engaged. Despite this, Neville Chamberlain is remembered as the man who foolishly appeased Hitler and Mussolini and failed to recognize that their military adventurism could not be satisfied by diplomacy, a characterization which Churchill himself would later promote in his 6-volume history of the Second World War. Yet Neville Chamberlain was far more than the man who returned from Munich with a worthless piece of paper. As a young man, he had spent 6 grueling years working tirelessly on a failed business venture in the Bahamas, before becoming a successful businessman, a position which enabled him to play a significant role in Birmingham civil society. As Chancellor and later Lord Mayor of Birmingham, Neville Chamberlain was an active social reformer, inspired by his father's radicalism, an attitude which he carried into national politics as Minister of Health and Chancellor of the Exchequer, playing a key part in the development of the British welfare state and engineering a partial recovery from the Great Depression. By the time he became Prime Minister in May 1937, his political accomplishments amounted to much more than either his father Joe or his brother Austin. Rather than as the crowning glory of a relatively brief but consequential political career, Chamberlain's premiership proved to be the black stain on his reputation. He had actively appeased Hitler and Mussolini, found excuses for their military aggression, and censored criticism of the 2 fascist leaders in the press. At the same time, he authorized the rearmament program, which built the aircraft that would win the Battle of Britain during the final months of his life. Even after he was forced to step aside as Prime Minister, he continued to support Churchill in his determination to fight and win the war. What do you think of Neville Chamberlain? Does he deserve to be remembered as a man who was duped by Hitler and Mussolini and failed to recognize their true nature until it was too late? Or should he be better known for his previous record as a dynamic social reformer in local and national politics, who achieved much in improving the lives of the poorest people in British society? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.